Well, it's great to be with you this morning. It really is. So this morning, what I'm going to do is going to talk to you from Psalm 67 in a few moments' time. If you've never read Psalm 67, I recommend. Well, you will this morning, but I recommend you do. It's known as a great missionary psalm. Just want to tell you about some of the things that God is doing, and maybe some of the vision, which a video I'll play in a moment, for Elim Missions and where we're going. I think one of the things that I've become increasingly aware of for us as Elim Missions is that we do so much. There's an awful lot. If you go to our website, there's an awful lot of things that we do. But increasingly, I've been stirred to go, well, what's the one thing? If there was one thing that we were going to do, and I hinted at it, that sense of partnering with the Spirit in the renewal of all things, because Jesus isn't just interested about us knowing him in this side of eternity and waiting for heaven to come. He wants us to be involved actively in his work here on earth as it is in heaven. So he wants to partner with us. He wants to use us. And that, for me, has been the greatest game changer for my faith, like nothing else, actually. When I understood that actually the God of heaven wants to use me to be involved in his work. You know, we prayed for those taking the GCSEs just a moment ago. Amazing. I always think back to my GCSEs and the fear and trepidation of going into those exams. I hate exams. In fact, I didn't do great in school, because I was more interested in playing football and going out on my bike. I didn't do great at A-levels either, and I didn't do too well at my degree. And I stand back in amazement and go, God, what on earth are you doing? Because it isn't about our qualifications on paper that is the hindrance or the accelerator for God to use us. It's actually about a heart of willingness and obedience to say, God, I will go wherever, do whatever, whenever you tell me to do it. That's all actually that God requires. Now, if you've got some pieces of paper with some letters after your name, fantastic. It can be really helpful. And I would encourage any young person to put their heart and soul into education and learning and growing, because I think it's really important. But it isn't a precursor to God using you. And so what God is looking for is a heart that is willing to respond. And that's what I get to see across the globe. Is people who are just saying, here I am, Lord, send me. Lord, I'm willing to go. You see, the most amazing thing, if you were to meet some of our missionaries, they're just really ordinary. They're really ordinary people who have just said yes to Jesus. Said, yes, I'm willing to go. Now, the other thing that's really important, I think, for me to say is that generally it's about 1% of the Christian population of the church who will actually go and do cross-cultural mission. Long term. It's not a huge percentage. So just this morning, who's going to be the 1%? Because the rest of you are going to stay. And that isn't an excuse then to not be involved in mission, because actually the nations, one of the beautiful things I think about the UK is the nations of the world are coming to the UK. And the nations of the world are a movement. There's a movement of people across the earth that going to nations. So what does that mean? It means there is an opportunity for us to be engaged with a bigger picture mission of God right on our doorstep, as well as being sent overseas. So how do we do it? Well, I think we have to have this grand view of what God has called us to. Because otherwise, we have a tendency to live small lives. Or is that just me? Like just the small inhabitation of our own family and our own occupation, our own street or neighborhood, our own town, our own city, our own village, whatever it might be. We can live really small lives. And I think God has called us to live an expansive life in him. Even if that means staying local, I think we can live a big life for him, because he's lived a big life for us. And he died a big death for us so that we might live a big life in him. Now, your definition of a big life will be different to mine. Because you're unique. You're designed by God for a purpose. You're crafted in him. Perfectly crafted in him. And so it's futile to compare your life to mine. Because your call, your life is not mine, and my life is not yours. So when I talk about living a big life, I guess I'm asking you, what does that look like for you? Is your life and your world, is it small? Or is it expansive? Is it open? And I think what I see across the world and are people, missionaries and pioneers, church planters, educationalists, people who are just willing to say, Jesus, I'm going to go out there. They've made the choice to not live a small life. And so we have Lynette, who's working in the Philippines, in Cebu. Not in Cebu, sorry, she's in Manila. Working in City Gates Academy, leading a school that's providing quality education for children who are in some of the communities that are surrounding that school, who wouldn't otherwise have access to education, would have no chance of getting out of the cycle of poverty. She's investing and training in leaders, quality teachers who have then gone on to other places to lead in other schools and other settings to bring the standard of education up. So what is she doing? She's not just teaching lessons. She's partnering the spirit of the renewal of all things. Why? Because she's got this vision of the gospel that says actually through education, through the gospel, through the message of hope, through being a person of hope, we can break some of the cycle that keeps people in these places of poverty. And we can tell you about our church planters in South Asia who do all kinds of projects with the single goal and the single objective to see their nation won for Christ, to see communities transformed and villages changed. During COVID, when we were in lockdown, and lots of nations were struggling. Like we were so blessed, actually, as a nation. You might not have felt like it, but we had access to support. We had access to furlough schemes, all of that kind of stuff. Now, I know that some fell through the gaps, and I know it wasn't always easy. I know it was tough, but actually, in some of the nations of the world, they don't have those systems in place. And so through the COVID appeal that we did, we were able to send finances to this particular worker. I'm not giving names and locations just because of the security risks we would potentially post them if they're going out online. But they were able to put together some food parcels for their church planter who began to go into the southeast region of the country and work with, just connect with some families. And so over a 3-month period, this church planter began just keep going back to these particular families, talking about Jesus, having conversations, answering questions, prayerfully considering where the opportunities might come. And after about 3 months or so, this whole family came to faith in Jesus. And then another family came to faith in Jesus, and now there's a church that's been established, and other churches that are being established because they're not only doing food now, they're doing water projects where they're putting a borehole in for as little, I think they said 250 pounds. They could put a borehole in that would provide water for a whole community. And as a result, there's been 400 people that have been impacted because they've been doing this thing. 6 churches have been planted in places where the gospel hadn't gone, and communities are being changed because somebody says, Jesus, I'm prepared to live a big life for you. It's amazing. And, the danger is, I come into a church and I tell these stories about what God is doing around the world, and we go, wow, isn't it amazing? I hope you're saying, isn't it amazing? And it's like, it's incredible what God is doing. You go, oh, God, what about here? Well, I think God is doing some incredible things in the UK, if only we'd have eyes to see. So often we compare it to what God is doing over here, and it's different. It's different context, different people, different mission. Not different mission, same mission, but different field. And we compare it. Can we be inspired by it? Absolutely. But what is God doing here that we can celebrate? So where are the stories? Where are the opportunities? And I want to tell you this morning, if you don't already know it, that actually the opportunities are right before you. If only you'll have eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to respond. Because God is active on the earth. And that includes the United Kingdom. We talk about going to the nations. Well, the UK is part of that. England is part of that. Scotland is part of that. Wales is part of that. Northern Ireland is part of that. Republic of Ireland is part of that. We're part of the nations of the world. And God is doing incredible things. But there is a challenge for us. Because I think so often we've rested in our comfort. We've rested in the fact that actually we don't face the kind of challenges and persecution that some of our brothers and sisters across the globe do. And you know what I find? It's not that everything's always easy in those places, because it isn't. It's not that the gospel always breaks forth in those places, because it sometimes doesn't. But what I do find is that where there are believers in the context of those challenging environments, there is a resilience to their faith, because they understand something of the grace of God that's been at work in them. The grace of God to sustain them. And they have this vision of the gospel that supersedes anything that they can experience here on earth, because the vision is far bigger. And I think the challenge for us in the UK is, one, to really understand that if we were to live the kind of life that Jesus has purposed us for, there would be movement in Bath and beyond. There would be movement in your neighborhood, in your streets, in your workplaces, because we're relentlessly focused on the one thing. And I think sometimes we can be so distracted by many things. So should we turn to Psalm 67? Because I think this will help us anchor some of these things that I've been saying just in these moments. Kenny, what time do you normally try to finish? In by 3? Excellent, because I've got about 4 hours worth of material. No, I haven't. Well, that's fine. We'll be done by about 10 to 3. So may God be gracious to us and bless us. May he make his face shine upon us. Just pause there for a moment. May God be gracious to us and bless us. May he make his face shine upon us. So that your way may be known on earth, your salvation among all nations, not just some nations, all nations. Let the peoples praise you, God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations rejoice and shout for joy, for you judge the peoples with fairness and lead the nations on earth. Let the peoples praise you, God. Let all the peoples praise you. The earth has produced its harvest. God, our God, blesses us. God will bless us, and all the ends of the earth will fear him. What a magnificent psalm. We don't know the author. In fact, there's a bit of conjecture about the setting and the context for it, but one scholar suggests that it was around the time of Sennacherib in 2 Kings chapter 19 and the miraculous rescue of Israel from that king. Makes sense. Jibing the God of Israel. And here we have this psalm reflecting the sovereign nature of the one in whom Israel worships. He's not just the God of Israel. He is the God of the nations. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. He is the ruler and maker and sustainer of all things. There is nobody like him. So this God in whom we worship holds all things together. He holds it all in the palm of his hands. And so when the psalmist is crying out, may God be gracious to us and bless us, may he make his face to shine upon us, I'd like to suggest that this is the prayer of offering and plea and cry of this people. God, be gracious to us. I don't know about you, but I sometimes reflect upon my own life and I go, God, how on earth did you get me here? I think about some of the mistakes, some of the failures. Please tell me I'm not on my own. Anybody else made some mistakes? Anybody else made some failures? Anybody else look back in life and go, oh, Lord, if only. But we cry out with the psalmist, be gracious to us. We go, do you know what grace is? Grace is getting what we do not deserve. So when I think about my exam results and I think about what God has done in my life, and I hope through me in these years that I've been seeking to follow him, I look back and go, God, you're so gracious, because I didn't deserve any of it. Because everything that we have is a gift of grace. Absolutely everything. There is not one thing that we've been given that isn't grace. How did we enter the world? I entered naked as a dot of age. That's it. Nothing. And everything that I had after that was a gift of grace. Everything. And you know what? At some point in the, I hope, distant future, I'm going to leave this earth with nothing. Except that which has been stored up in eternal places, the eternal fruit of my life on earth. And the same is true for you. We'll leave with nothing. So the question is, what are we going to give ourselves to in light of God's grace to us? Because everything is grace. And you see, I think when we rightly understand grace, it eliminates entitlement. Because I think entitlement is really ugly. Anybody ever met anybody entitled? I have. Oh, it makes me want to vomit. Because it's so self-absorbed, self-interested. It's just an ugly trait. But grace, when we rightly understand grace, not as a license to do as we please, but a license to live for God with all our heart, with all our fullness, because it's grace that we're able to do it. We don't deserve it, yet he invites us and gives us the opportunity to do it. It's all grace. Rightly understood, it propels us to a life of thankfulness and a life of purpose in him, because it's all grace. See, the entitlement was, well, I deserve this. I deserve what I have. And I deserve more because I work hard. Entitlement and grace, they're opposed. So God's people, I think we should be marked by people of grace. You see, grace doesn't keep us in the state it found us. Grace transforms us. You know, as I was thinking about what to share and prepare this with you this day, I couldn't get John 8 out of my mind, the opening chapters of John 8. And there's, that interaction between the Pharisees as they brought the woman who'd been caught in adultery out. And they bring her to Jesus, and Jesus, I love the way that Jesus plays it. Because he could have been the one to cast the stone. He could have been the one to put condemnation upon her, because she'd been caught in the act. But what does he do? I'd love to know what he was writing, wouldn't you? Because he gets down, and as they're there, he says that he's without sin, cast the first stone. And they're all... Pharisees then begin to go, I'm not sure I can. So they go. The older ones first. because they recognize, oh man, I'm not so perfect, maybe after all. But Jesus, the righteous one, holy one, just gets down and starts to write. And then he looks up at the woman. I love the way that Jesus does this. Because to everybody else, she was just a prostitute, an adulterer. Just this harlot woman. Well, it doesn't really matter what happens to her because she's sinful. But Jesus treats her with dignity. He looks at her, gets down on her level, and he says, go and leave your life. Sorry, has nobody condemned you? Has nobody done that? Go and leave your life of sin. The state in which Jesus found her, he didn't leave her, but he set her free to live this life of freedom. Shame lifted. Could you imagine the shame that she felt in that moment when Jesus says, I'm not going to condemn you, but I'm going to tell you to leave your life of sin. Free. And you see, grace doesn't keep us in a guilt and shame. Grace frees us. It liberates us. And I just wonder whether some of you have been living under shame. You've been carrying it. You think, I don't deserve it. You're right, you don't deserve it. But God's grace is sufficient for you. And he is able and powerful to liberate you so that you may be set free to live the kind of life that he's purposed you to live, to go and sin no more. I think so many of us live under the lie that sin's power is too strong. That is anti-gospel, because the gospel breaks the power of sin and darkness and sets you free. So this morning, if you're living under that, I want to tell you this morning that Jesus' power is able to set you free. Because his grace is sufficient for you. So that's point number one. Let's live a life of grace. Crying out, God, be gracious to us and bless us. Make your face to shine upon us. Do you know, there's something about the facial expressions. Now, I've been told my facial expressions reveal a lot. I never used to think that they did, but they do, apparently. And so when you scorn and frown, what does it do to somebody? Like if I'm looking at my kids and like you're being naughty, maybe give a little bit of a, all right, Dad. But if I smile, if I beam when they come into the room, like my face lights up. Hannah, Sarah, you're here. What does it do to their sense of worth and value? Rather than, oh, please just be quiet. I mean, there are times where I tell them to be quiet because they're just really noisy. But if that's all they get. And Spurgeon said this, and hopefully it'll help somebody. A look of approval from God creates a delightful calm within the soul. A look of approval from God creates a deep, delightful calm in the soul. When you're crying out for grace, he's not looking with scorn. He's looking with delight. He's looking upon you with a smile. May your face shine upon us and be gracious to us. Amazing, eh? Okay, point number 2, the purpose. So, saved by grace, amazing grace. Incredible grace, sets us free kind of grace. Is it just so that we can wait for Jesus to come back and we'll be with him forever, or we go to be with purpose through which and why he saves us and pours out his grace upon us? Well, I think verse 2 tells us exactly why we are saved, exactly why God blesses us, exactly why God pours his grace upon us, so that your way may be known on earth. Your salvation among all nations, so that your way may be known on earth. How on earth are people going to know what the way of Jesus is unless the people of Jesus walk in his way? See, this is what I'm talking about, grace. Grace is the foundation stone through which we can begin to even think about living a life of obedience. You see, so God's salvation, his blessing upon us, his people, is not for us in and of ourselves. It's so that his way of salvation, his grace, his mercy, his kindness might be made known among all people, among the nations, including people of Bath. So if there is no distinction between God's people and the rest of the nations and the ways of the nations, then how on earth are they going to know that there's any difference between the God we worship and the gods they worship? Because everybody worships something. Everybody. What we worship, though, is of ultimate importance. And not what, but who we worship. And so if as God's people we aren't on this journey of transformation, this journey of being shaped and formed in the likeness of Christ, walking in his ways together, not just in isolation, because I think we've been so good at that, haven't we? Isolation of our lives in our own little world that it's me and Jesus kind of thing. Well, how on earth are we going to learn the way of Jesus if we never do it in the context of community, if we never do it in the context of being gracious to one another and helping one another grow and walk in the ways of Jesus? How are people going to know who Jesus is and the life that he's called us unless they see evidence in and through his people? And that means us going out of these doors into every part of society, radiating the life of Christ at work in us. Why? Because we understand that we are graced by him. I've got to be honest, I'm an idealist. All right? So I'm an idealist. I have these dreams and visions of what it might look like for the church to be a thriving community with the life of Christ overflowing in us so that wherever we go as his people, people begin to encounter the presence because we're people who carry his presence. Because we're so grace-filled, so kind, so focused on justice and mercy and righteousness that it just transforms environments. Because we're walking in his way. Sometimes go, Jesus, is it possible? Kenny, do you ever think, is it possible? I think it's possible. Because he takes the ordinary things and people of this world and he does extraordinary things through us. Because all he's looking for is a life that's surrendered and say, Jesus, I will walk with you, follow you wholeheartedly. And when we fail, because how many of us on the journey of this walk with Jesus have made some errors in judgment? See, it's not about camping there. If we camp there, then we've got no hope. I think when we camp in those environments, and it doesn't mean to say there isn't process and work to get out of that stuff and consequences. Absolutely. But actually the grace of God lifts us out of those and transforms us. And I wonder whether I'd be the kind of person I am today if I'd not made some of the choices of my past. Because God in his grace used some of those things to knock some of the edges off. So that hopefully I become a little bit more like Jesus. And I think the same is true for you. Did God cause it? No, there was choices we make. Did God purpose it? I don't know. He's God. But ultimately, I know that there's stuff in our lives that can either help us or hinder us. And it can help us when we bring it to the throne of grace and choose to walk in his ways. Because what better testimony to a world that is broken and lost than a life that is being transformed by Jesus? How are they going to know unless they see the evidence of the grace of God at work in us? God be gracious to us and bless us so that your way may be known on the earth. I think that manifests itself in all kinds of ways. I think it manifests itself in the way that we talk with people. Like kindness. Kindness isn't being nice, by the way. It's elements of it. But I think kindness is this ability to speak things that are true with absolute grace. Sometimes some of the kindest things people have said to me have been some of the hardest things. but they've been kind because it's brought transformation. And so I think when we talk about engaging in mission with our world and our people on our doorstep or whatever it might be, then how can we demonstrate the kindness of God which has been evident in our lives with those that are before us? Do we see a problem or do we see a person? Do we see an issue or do we see a person? Because when God looked at us, he didn't see the issues, he saw a person. And he began to deal with the issues. He saw a person. And I think as we are shaped by grace and we engage in mission, our purpose is found in taking this blessing of God to the nations so they may see that actually it's available for them too. God's grace is available for them. This is all wrapped up with the covenant promise of God to Abraham in Genesis 12. Go to the nations so that your ways, of God, go to the nations. Through him, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Flourishing communities being transformed by Jesus. Places of grace and mercy and kindness. Number 3, the posture. So we've got the prayer, the purpose, and then the posture of God's people. Let the peoples praise you, God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations rejoice and shout for joy. For you judge the peoples with fairness and lead the nations on earth. Let the peoples praise you, oh God. Let all the peoples praise you. The posture of praise. The desire, isn't it, that every single nation, tongue and tribe will proclaim the praise and the adoration of the one who gave his life for all. The one who holds all things together, the one who sustains all things, the one who's now seated on the throne, around which every nation, tongue, and tribe will one day gather and sing praises and glory and adoration to the one who rules. Revelation 7, have a read of it and get this picture of the nations gathered, every tongue and tribe gathered. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. So as I'm thinking about this, I'm going, well, what does that look like for us? Is it simply about us singing our songs, our praise songs? I love praise songs, don't you? I love it. I love the environment of praise. When we come together and praise, but it's got to be more than that. It's got to be more than singing our songs. It's a posture of our heart. And it's so easy to let the concerns and worries of this world, of our life and here and now, suppress the praise because we can't maybe see a way through it. But I wonder what would happen if we began to turn that around a little. And rather than allowing the worries and concerns of this life to determine how we praise, allow our praise to determine how we see the worries and concerns of this world, because it's in those moments, as you begin to engage in conversation with people that you come into your life who don't yet know Jesus, they may go, do you know, I just don't know how you manage to cope with all the stress and the strain. I don't know how you manage to cope with the increasing energy bills. I don't know how you manage to cope with the cost of living that keeps going up. Do you know, I just don't know how you manage to cope with the pressure of rent and mortgage and all of that. I just don't understand how you manage to cope when the boss is giving you a hard time. I just don't understand how you cope when you've got all this work to do and everything's to be piling on you and you've got this going on with your family. And you go, I just don't understand how you do it. Well, you go, do you know what? I'm choosing to praise in the midst of circumstances because I know the one who reigns over all things. I know that this is not the end, but my future is that which is to come in the new heaven and the new earth. And one day everything will be made new. So I'm choosing to live a life of praise in light of that which is to come because it helps me to understand and see things differently in the here and the now. Choose a life of praise. Because our praise shapes the atmosphere of our hearts, and our atmosphere of our hearts changes environments. So when we step into wherever it is God places us, wherever it is that we are sent, it begins to change. Because you are the change that I think so many people desire and long, because you see evidenced in our own lives. We step into those places with a different atmosphere, a different heart, a different atmosphere in our heart and our lives. And people say, oh, you've got a bit of an aura. Have you ever heard that? Like, oh, there's something different about you. And they don't know how to work it out. It's the presence of God. Tell people. And I think that kind of posture in our hearts opens missional opportunities if we'll look and we'll hear and we'll obey. Because praise is a culture changer. It shapes us. And I think that a posture of praise enables us to come to a place of flourishing even when everything around us seems to be chaos. Because the evidence of God's blessing is not in the abundance of our wealth or the abundance of stuff. Does God sometimes choose to bless us in such ways? I cannot deny it. It's grace. But the abundance of our wealth is determined by the posture of our heart and the spiritual blessings, as Paul writes in Ephesians 1, that have been poured out upon us. Every spiritual blessing available to us. Peter writes in 2 Peter 1, we have everything that we need to live a life of godliness, everything. To live a life of abundance in him has been deposited in us by the Holy Spirit. It's his life at work in us. So as we surrender to him, as we walk with him, as we praise him, I think the Holy Spirit begins to do amazing things in us that we can't even begin to imagine or dream, that we can't even begin to manufacture, actually, because it comes out of this place, as we heard this week, of abiding with Jesus. And what's the fruit of abiding with Jesus? It's his life at work in us. I find it really interesting that so many of us strive to be fruitful. Have you ever seen an apple tree strive to be fruitful? Any tree, for that matter. It will bear fruit. If it's planted right, if it's rooted right, if there is nourishment for those roots, and it's not dead, it will bear fruit. It cannot help but bear fruit. I know the cycles, I think, with apple trees of when it's most fruitful, and I don't understand it fully. I'm no gardener, so please, if you are, then explain it to me afterwards. But I understand that actually, if its roots are right, it will produce apples. It's not going to produce pineapples. It'll produce apples. It'll produce that which it was designed to produce. And so many of us, I've come across it so often. I've been it. Where I've tried and strived to be fruitful by doing loads and loads of things, busying myself with kingdom activity. And actually, I think the promise of John 15 is if you abide with me, if you be with me, if you rest with me, if you dwell with me, and I with you, you will bear fruit. And that, I think, cultivates a heart of praise. I think that we can't help but praise in that environment. God, you're so good. You're so gracious. You're so magnificent. Jesus, just let praise erupt. Speak in tongues and let yourself go wild a little bit. As a Pentecostal church, let the praise arise and let's see what God does. And you know what? I think we begin to step into fruitfulness when we least expect it. Because we're walking with Jesus. And when we walk with Jesus, we'll do the things that Jesus did. Because we'll become increasingly like him. Okay, so that's the posture of praise, creating atmospheres and changing attitudes. Reproducing life. And then the produce. So Psalm 67 says this: the earth has produced its harvest. God, our God, will bless us. God will bless us, and all the ends of the earth will fear him. Produce. Do you long to see the fruit, not of endless activity, but of kingdom activity? Do you long to see lost people, the nations of the world, whether in Bath or beyond? Do you long to see lost people come to faith in Jesus, the harvest? Because the harvest is abundant, isn't it? It's abundant. There are over 40% of the world population have yet to hear about Jesus. 40%. Staggering, isn't it? 40%. there's still over 7,000 unreached people groups in this world. Like, staggering. So that's true of the continents, it's true of here. Could there be, in Bath, an unreached people group that have come from the nations of the world to Bath for work, for life, whatever it might be? They might not be in this room this morning, but they could be. Could there be in the surrounding area of an unreached people group? Imagine what could happen if the church, your church, my church, began to look for the nations of the world where God is active, where people have come and where there's opening and opportunity for the gospel. Imagine what would happen. Just imagine what could happen with unreached people groups if the church, UK and globally, began to think differently. Imagine what could happen if somebody from an unreached people group came to faith in Jesus in the UK or States or wherever, any other part of Europe or wherever it is else in the world. They come to faith in Jesus, and then Jesus says, great. You know you came to the UK for a great life. You know you came to the UK to get away from it all. I understand that some parts of the world are a terrible place. Honestly, this is not being flippant, but just imagine, because I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility for Jesus to do this. Because there are some places that you and I just could not go. I say we couldn't go. Maybe am I putting limits on? Maybe. But it's unlikely. Language barriers, cultural barriers, all kinds of things. But somebody from an unreached people group, say for instance, maybe one part of India comes to faith in Jesus. And then Jesus goes, I'm sending you back. I'm sending you back because you're going to be a light to the nations. And it's going to be tough. It's going to be hard. It's going to be challenging. But you're going back. Imagine Jesus positioning people into these groupings of people, calling people, because there's been a movement on the earth. Why? Because the harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Why is the workers few? Because sometimes they're sat in a pew. And so what Jesus is looking for, he's looking for people who are willing to say, here I am, Lord, send me. Because the question is not if you're called, or if you're sent even. The question is, to whom are you called, and to whom are you being sent? That's the question. Each and every one of God's people has been called to participate in his mission. No excuses, no get-out clauses. When he calls, he equips, and when he equips, he sends. And he sends us into the harvest because the harvest is abundant, and he will reap his harvest. He's just looking for people to partner with him in the process. And that, my friends, is you and I. So where is he calling you? And to whom is he calling you? And the question then is, are you willing to say, here I am, Lord, send me? Thanks so much for listening this morning. I want to pray for you, if that's okay. Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Jesus, I thank you for Bath Elim. I thank you for the long history and heritage that is within this fellowship. Lord, I thank you for the nations that are represented among this congregation. Thank you, Jesus, that it is reflective of your heart for the nations. Jesus, I pray that you would stir just an increased missional zeal within the life of this fellowship. I pray, Lord, that you'd give the leaders wisdom and insight and strategy as to how to connect with nations both locally and internationally. Jesus, I pray that you'd just create an expansive life in this church that goes beyond what they're experiencing now and increases in capacity and reach. That, Lord, this community would be alive in you, thriving in you, and overflowing with grace. Jesus, I thank you for your grace upon them. Lord, I'm asking that you would pour out your Spirit afresh. That you'd help each and every one collectively and individually discern where it is that you're calling. And if it is for international mission, I pray that you just help them through that process of discernment to understand what it is you're asking and count the cost. But Jesus, I thank you that your harvest is abundant. Your harvest is abundant, and you will reap your harvest. It will produce harvest. But Lord, you want us to partner with you in the process. So would you help us to be brave? Would you help us to have eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to respond in obedience to your call? For those, Jesus, that you're drawing to yourself in Bath, I pray that you would bring connections with people here that would be catalytic for their salvation and transformation and then sending into your field. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.